Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, in recognition of World AIDS Day, Stephanie Desmon speaks to Dr. Chris Beyrer, director of the Duke Global Health Institute and a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for PEPFAR, the global bipartisan AIDS program that has been credited with saving 25 million lives over the last 20 years. They discuss why American politics are jeopardizing the reauthorization of PEPFAR and what could be lost if no agreement is made. Let's listen.
Chris Beyrer, thanks so much for joining me.
Great to be with you, Stephanie.
Today, I want to talk to you about PEPFAR. And the first question I have, of course, is what is it?
PEPFAR, which is an acronym for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, is the largest commitment in history to a single disease. It was initiated by President George W. Bush in 2003 with an initial $15 billion commitment over 5 years.
And what has it accomplished in that 20 years?
Yeah, well, it's been reauthorized 4 times now. So this year actually is the 20th anniversary of the PEPFAR program. And it has maintained, I think, almost uniquely of programs of this size and scope, true bipartisan support for all of these 20 years. So it was continued by President Obama. It was continued by President Trump. So successive administrations have supported the program. And the reason why is because it's been so effective. What it initially set out to do in 2003, we had a very unique situation. The situation was that HIV, which had been a uniformly fatal disease and one for which we spent really 15 years in a frustrating search of trying to find treatments. We finally had effective therapy in 1996. And that was the famous triple therapy, the cocktail. It was 3 antiviral drugs used together. And at the beginning, there were some pretty toxic drugs, and some had to be taken with food, others not with food, and the timing was tricky. And the cost was over $20,000 per patient per year to be on these drugs. And there were a number of other medications required as well for other opportunistic infections. So it was a complicated, expensive therapy, but it worked. And people who really had been on their deathbeds rose up. It was called the Lazarus effect, because literally people rose up off their deathbeds and went back to work and back to parenting and back to education. But very quickly, it became clear that this was happening in the US, it was happening in other industrialized countries in Europe, but the majority of patients were in low and middle income countries. And the largest share of them, about 75%, were in sub-Saharan Africa, where there was no therapy. So we went for a number of years, 96, 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001. And I was working in these countries at the time, and it was just brutal. And patients would say to you, we understand that we could be treated, like this is treatable. When will it be our turn? And we really didn't have an answer. And when George Bush announced the program in 2003 with this $15 billion commitment, there were many of us who were somewhat skeptical that he would actually follow through and that the Congress would fund it. But the pressure was so intense, and the dying, and the number of people dying, and the number of parents dying and leaving orphan children had just become such a serious social threat. There were real concerns that a number of African countries and others like Haiti were really going to a healthcare system collapse because of these enormous burdens. And of course, just because the AIDS pandemic was happening doesn't mean that other people don't get sick. And so there really was a challenge. Hospitals, facilities. Within 2 years, by about 2005, the entire landscape had changed. There were, at the time, about initially 2 or 3 million people on therapy. And over the next decade, we really stopped the dying. There was an extraordinary expansion. Right now, the majority of people living with HIV worldwide are on therapy. That is a huge sea change. We're getting close to 70% of all people who need therapy being on it. That would not have happened without PEPFAR. It also prevented at least 2 million perinatal transmissions. So those are pediatric infections that otherwise would have led to pediatric AIDS, which is a terrible disease. And again, was until PEPFAR uniformly fatal, really. And they were very hard kids to take care of. And it was a tragic disease. So preventing that many millions of infections was enormous. It also provided, of course, treatment for tuberculosis. And so we had a sea change in the amount of TB, although TB remains a problem. And then that legislation, the legislation that created PEPFAR, which, by the way, had Republican and Democratic co-sponsors across the aisle, Lindsey Graham and Ted Kennedy, John Kerry, an incredible array of people who don't normally sign on to bills together were original co-sponsors. But that also created this Office of Global AIDS Coordinator. It was created in the State Department, which was rather unique because, of course, we have things like the NIH and CDC and USAID, which would be the natural home for a program like this. But President Bush wanted it to be directly under his control. And so he created the director of the program at the rank of ambassador and put that person right under the Secretary of State. At the time, it was Condoleezza Rice was the Secretary of State. So the PEPFAR director has always been an ambassador, and that meant that we could use the embassies and consulates all over the world as partners for PEPFAR. And it remains the largest commitment to a single disease in history, just to give you a feel for the scale that we're talking about. In Uganda, PEPFAR spends over $1 million a day on antiviral therapy. That's the burn rate. In South Africa, the burn rate of PEPFAR is 2 million, a little more than 2 million a day. And that is keeping at the current tally about 24 million people across the world on life-saving antiviral therapy.
So with so much success, it's in danger. What's going on?
It is. I should say one other thing about PEPFAR that's really important, which is that the only way that this became possible and feasible was an agreement. It was an agreement between the G8 countries and pharma. It was called the Gleneagles Summit, which basically created a 2-tier price structure for antiviral drugs. So the way it works is that the G8 countries, it's the G7 plus Russia, agreed that they would pay full fare. They would continue to pay full market price for antivirals in their own countries. But the companies would then also license a number of low and middle income countries to manufacture much less expensive generic drugs. And those countries initially were Brazil, South Africa, Thailand, and India. And as soon as that happened, the price of drugs for the developing world just absolutely crashed. So I'll give you an example right now. The triple therapy that is probably the most widely used in the United States. It's a triple combination based on dolutegravir. It's called Biktarvy, is the commercial brand name. Costs about $24,000 a year per patient in the United States. In South Africa, it's $75 a year. So that's why it's doable. That's why we were able to do it. Now, what happened in the PEPFAR leadership is, of course, the director of PEPFAR, because it's an ambassadorial rank position, requires Senate approval. So there have been a number of PEPFAR directors. The current PEPFAR ambassador is a man named John Nkengasong. He's the first person with an African heritage. He's Cameroonian American. He was previously the director. He's a longtime US CDC leader. And he, before taking this job, was director of the Africa CDC. He was the founding director. Before him was Ambassador Debbie Birx. And Debbie Birx, of course, was leading PEPFAR under President Trump when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and she stepped into the White House as a pandemic advisor, and then there was an acting director. In some ways, that was the beginning of the challenges where we are now. An acting director is not really empowered to lead the program in the same way. We have had, of course, a conservative shift in the Congress. We ended up in the last midterms with the Republicans getting the House, getting control of the House by a very narrow margin, as you know. And suddenly we found ourselves in the spring with the next 5-year reauthorization coming up, for the first time, a bipartisan divide on PEPFAR. And the fundamental problem was that there was an allegation which wasn't thoroughly investigated and turned out to be completely false. It was a fictitious allegation that the Biden administration was diverting PEPFAR dollars into abortion care in Africa. So this became, as so many things have become in our country, fundamentally an outcome of the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, the opening up of this enormous set of complicated problems, partisan political problems, and basically a small group of not government officials, but NGOs, including very conservative evangelical NGOs like Focus on the Family, Franklin Graham's NGO. These groups put forward that the Biden administration was misusing PEPFAR dollars for abortion care. Now, you have to remember that George Bush also had a lot of evangelical support. He was a conservative Christian himself. And when the PEPFAR legislation was created, it explicitly barred any use of PEPFAR dollars for abortion care. So that's always been in the law, and it's always been followed. These allegations came out, as I said, sort of out of the conservative ecosphere that's out there, and they have been thoroughly investigated. And there is no evidence that PEPFAR dollars, nobody has produced a shred of evidence to show that this is the case. Nevertheless, it then became this dividing issue. And the evangelical group, which scores legislators, decided that they would score legislators on whether or not they voted for PEPFAR reauthorization. And that would be a black mark against them from the perspective of their support for life, their being pro-life. So that's very risky for many Republicans. Many Republicans, of course, are elected in very Republican-dense districts where pro-life sentiment is very strong. And if you don't get their sort of highest rating as protecting unborn life, if you are seen as not fully supportive of the repeal of abortion rights, it can really have an impact on your reelection. So that has made them extremely cautious, right? On the other hand, there is a strong push from the Democratic side to say that PEPFAR needs to be less of a vertical program all about AIDS and to do more about health systems, including reproductive health for women. And that, which is uncontroversial in public health, can be viewed from the opposing side as basically a Trojan horse for abortion, right? Women's reproductive health, seen as a potentially threatening term. So we have ended up where the reauthorization has not gotten out of committee. The Republicans control the committee, and so it hasn't even come up for a vote. We have plenty of votes for a reauthorization, but unless the speaker can get it out of committee and bring it to the floor, it won't be voted on. And right now, that is where we are stuck.
So what happens? I mean, first of all, it's expired, right? And so now we're on borrowed time here. What happens if it's not reauthorized? What happens to AIDS care around the world?
Yeah, so this is very important for people to understand. It's a little bit of the way the government works, which is the distinction between appropriation and authorization. So what you always want is for a program to be fully reauthorized. That means the House has voted on it. it has that approval, and it will be funded for however long the legislation is, which in this case is 5 years. So it would be another 5 years. What we were hoping for was a clean reauthorization. If you are not reauthorized, the program can still be appropriated, meaning that it's funded, but then it comes up in the budget every year. And it is, of course, much more vulnerable. Fundamental reality is that this is not, for example, a program that is funding something with a short window. A year of funding, if you're running a program where people have to be on antiviral therapy for life, is very challenging. And of course, next year will be a presidential election year, and all manner of things can happen in the budget negotiations because, of course, it'll be a partisan battle, and there will be attempts to undermine the Biden administration, and you can imagine how this could play out. So it makes any program that is not reauthorized but simply appropriated is much more vulnerable. It also sends a very challenging political message to our partners, which is already underway with all of the threats of government shutdowns and the inability to pass a budget and all those other challenges, which is to say, the U.S. is not a reliable partner here. The U.S. is not a reliable donor. And if you're running a healthcare system and you have millions of people on antiviral therapy supported by an unreliable partner, that's very challenging. It's very challenging to plan. It's very challenging to staff. These programs, many of them are operating as we want them to be through ministries of health. So the staff actually work for Uganda, the government, or South Africa, but they are supported by additional PEPFAR dollars, the laboratory supports, the drug costs, and all of those things suddenly look fragile. And it looks like countries, many of them very low income countries like Cote d'Ivoire and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, they will be very stretched if they suddenly have to take over supporting all these programs. Many of them will not be able to.
So that would really be a backsliding after all of these accomplishments.
That is a huge concern. And it's also, you have to remember, it's different with HIV from many other kinds of public health issues, because this is not a disease where you can, let's say you're on triple therapy and you're doing well, you stop for 6 months, and then you start again with the same drugs. That's not how it works. If you stop, you run the risk of resistance. And if you restart, those drugs may not work for you, and you have to go to the second tier, or in some cases, the third tier. And those are much more expensive, even with the dual pricing system. So we could increase drug resistance. That's a huge worry. And we could undermine the existing therapies, which would be really catastrophic.
Chris Beyrer, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmon. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.